the podcast for potential development by and with Uli Vogel. A warm welcome to everyone, dear listeners, to our episode today. And today, I have a really exciting guest with me. I'm especially happy about this episode because it's about some very special knowledge that not everyone in society knows about. And I'd like to give a very warm welcome to Leo Martin. Leo, it's great to have you with us today. Yeah.
Uli, not just a special guest, but also a special host for me. Usually, I have some journalist or moderator who isn't bringing their own topic. That makes today's sparring with you all the more exciting.
Very nice, Leo. Yeah, I remember well the time when you did your certification with us. You're also involved with profiling values, and it's going to be really exciting. Today, how should we start? Usually, people should get to know you a little bit. So I'll mention a few facts and figures and ask a bit about what you've done in life and which turns you've taken. Maybe that way, the thread will catch on a bit. And then we have 3 thumbnails or snippets that we picked out in advance, so to speak. And the first one is your time at the Office for the Protection of the Constitution. I said, what were the key learnings? You were there. For quite a long time, actually. The second point is your work after that, right up to today. I always find speakers really fascinating too, so we'll take a look at some of the topics you cover and, above all, what interests you. I'm interested in how you do that, and which values you address there as well. Our podcast is called Wordy Impulse, Value Impulses. That's always the bridge we build here. And then, very exciting, dear listeners, forensic text analysis. So, I'm really curious to hear what you have to say about that. All right, Leo, let's dive right in. The listeners want to get to know you. So, what is your educational background? I looked it up. You have a degree in public administration, criminalistics and criminology. That's already pretty fascinating on its own. I also know that you trained with Patricia Stanjek and did a profiling course there. You did. I'll be having Patricia on the podcast soon as well. She's also very connected to us, and I think that's how the connection came about. Your first longer stint was as a so-called operator, meaning covert information gathering and intelligence analysis at the Bavarian Office for the Protection of the Constitution. That was from 1998 to 2007. And then you went into self-employment, keynote speaking, public speaking in general, giving experiential talks on various topics. We'll take a look at that later as well. And then, since 2018, forensic text analysis. Dear Leo, what motivates someone to pursue criminology and forensic sciences professionally? Is it just by chance, like it sometimes is for me? For people who have made their career choice. What was it for you?
It all started with a very traditional police training. I come from a family of entrepreneurs, and my family has, for generations, produced bed linens. My great-grandfather brought fabrics and dyes from India, at a time when no one was thinking beyond Germany's borders. Back then, that was very visionary, very proactive. And with that, he created a product that simply didn't exist here at the time, in the premium segment. My father is a management consultant, so I come from a culture and mindset of entrepreneurship. But I felt for myself that I wanted something different. So I decided to do police training. You can imagine, there was no one at home who was happy about that. Happy? There was a real uproar at home. But they let me do it, and then something interesting happened. That's when I realized, for me, this police thing, it's pretty good for now. And right now, it's actually a ton of fun. But it's not something I want to do for the rest of my life. I realized that for myself already in the first year of training. And even then, I made a decision about it, basically. But of course, I still finished the training, dropping out of an apprenticeship. That would have caused even more trouble at home. So I managed to enjoy it, even though I knew it was only temporary. I ended up being the top of my class out of 360 people in that training year. And then something exciting happened again. Mentally, I had already checked out and was back looking at opportunities in the private sector. And then an offer came in from the Ministry of the Interior. Hey, what do you think? Why not join the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, study criminology there, and become an operative for the intelligence service? And yeah, that was the next exciting and, above all, unexpected twist in my life.
Great, so I actually see two parallels here. The first is being the odd one out in the family. My family is full of doctors, pharmacists, chemists, and so on. And then I went and studied political science. That really caused a stir, to put it mildly. And the other thing. Actually, in that context, it's that you also got into entrepreneurship. So, I was self-employed, also worked as an employee for quite a while, and you gained your own experiences here, but then you also took the leap. And I think we'll get into that a bit more in a moment. But what was the reason for actually deciding to leave? Because, doing criminology is really fascinating. But when you know it's just a phase, a chapter in your life, then of course it's important for yourself. But when do you actually, so to speak, draw the line? How was it for you? Yeah.
Well, that phase actually ended up being quite long overall. First there was police training, and then all of a sudden, another 10 years on top of that. Intelligence service, if you round it up. And yeah, I realized for myself that the higher you go in this government environment, I was on my way to the upper management track, had completed all the assessment centers that are required to do the next round of studies at the Leadership Academy in Hildrup. And then I realized that, at a certain level, leadership at the Office for the Protection of the Constitution really does mean leading. But it's under political pressure. I then noticed that, all of a sudden, you're no longer an operator, investigator, or someone clarifying structures. Instead, you become more and more of a bureaucrat and a desk jockey. More and more, it's no longer about proactive investigations, where, even in intelligence work, you sometimes have to take calculated risks if you want to get information, especially covert information. Instead, it's all about avoiding risks in advance out of excessive obedience. Avoiding bad news risks. And that's when I realized that's just not my style anymore. I'm the kind of person who likes to take calculated risks on purpose. I am the one who performs especially well under pressure. The one who manages to keep the goals clearly in focus, still make decisions, and keep the teams behind me. And if I have any strengths at all, those are it. And those were increasingly less in demand. I was then in leadership roles for 2 years. I think I led reasonably well. I also had my teams behind me. I also think there was a really nice mix of being liked and having respect, but still maintaining professional distance. So, it worked well, but it wasn't 100% me anymore. And then, for 2 years, I asked myself every day, Leo, why are you still doing this job? And whatever the first thought was, okay, you're set for life. You're a career civil servant. I would have been in the upper service, then in the higher ranks. You have a solid, really, really good income. That completely satisfied my needs. But the first thing was always, okay, you're safe. This is the last day of your life. And for me, security was never one of those values that held any special importance. So job satisfaction was there on fewer and fewer days because the action was missing, the activity, getting things done, overcoming challenges. And then after 2 years, I was sitting there, I was living in Munich at the time, at my kitchen table, and over my muesli at breakfast, I made the decision, right, you're leaving now. And just the fact that for 2 years I couldn't pinpoint why I was still doing this job was reason enough for me, in that moment, to say, that's it, and I quit without a plan B. Out of the state-imposed shackles.
That's a nice way of putting it. That's always how it is. That tension between security and freedom. I know that myself, too. I was employed for 14 years, and now I've been an entrepreneur for 16 years. At the very beginning, I once considered joining the BND, but then for me it was more about the Foreign Office, so to speak. The career, I didn't manage to get in, I wasn't accepted. But that appeal of higher public service. As a young person, and when it actually makes sense content-wise, and you certainly absorbed and understood the meaning and benefit of it, too, but when you reach those higher ranks and you're basically just moving the organization around, swayed by political winds. By the way, I think that's a really nice way you put it, with the strengths you mentioned. But I'd add one more, you're also someone who's direct and straightforward. You state your opinion and lay out the facts, sometimes quite bluntly. That's how I experienced you during our training, and I find that really enriching because there's no beating around the bush, no talking in circles. I can well imagine that this approach became less popular or didn't go over so well as you moved up into the higher ranks. And so that's how it went, and you jumped out, as you said, basically into the deep end. Yeah, so, what kind of business model do you come up with then? I'm sure you've thought it over from every angle, but how do you actually get started? After 9 years, in the Office for the Protection of the Constitution. That's something I'm really interested in.
I also have an interesting perspective on values when it comes to the topic of the Office for the Protection of the Constitution. You mentioned that when work is meaningful, when it has purpose. And when I say I worked for the Domestic Intelligence Service, the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, ultimately, it's about protecting our liberal values and democracy. People always thought I did the job because that was what motivated me. But that wasn't the case at all. For me, that was just a nice side effect. That was a byproduct. My real motivation was something completely different. My job was actually to recruit informants within the world of organized crime. That means to infiltrate a structure, an organization that deliberately shuts itself off from the outside world because they don't want their networks, supply routes, or business models to become transparent. And to overcome a new challenge in this field every single day. That was my motivation. That's what I enjoyed. So, basically, it was the competitive drive that motivated me, not so much the idea of doing something good for society or protecting democracy and values.
Yeah, and I think especially when you go into it with that drive, that ambition, maybe it's the competitive mindset, to want to succeed here, it's actually a really good time, especially as a young person, to test your abilities and really find out what you can do. To see what you can actually achieve operationally and creatively. Still, I think the background you mentioned, yeah, kind of a byproduct, but the framework itself is, of course, something that, at least, looking back, I don't think that's a bad thing at all. It's really not so bad to have worked on this side of things. But I think, as you said, achieving success operationally here was what really mattered. And when you mention organized crime, maybe one last point before we move on to your self-employment. You did this for 9 years. If you look at this topic over those 9 years, and I'm sure you kept an eye on it a bit even after that, how has it? The development in society, is this something that really undermines us so much that it threatens our basic order? How would you assess it?
Well, organized crime. There are certainly a lot of places and countries in the world where organized crime is a completely different problem than it is here. I can sleep soundly at night, knowing that Germany invests a lot here, also through, at times, the intelligence services, the police, and customs, and so on and so forth. That's definitely a very preventative approach as well. With organized crime, it's considered what's called control crime. So you don't just stumble across it on your own, you can only detect it if you actively look for it. And you have to invest in it here as well. And Germany definitely does that at a very appropriate level, neither too much nor too little.
Okay. So if we compare that to Mexico or wherever else, we're still on a pretty good island here. But in your opinion, is that still guaranteed going forward? Will we stay at this level? Because, the challenges are getting bigger if we look at the last 20 years and also consider migration. And with that, there are more opportunities as well, maybe to form such cells.
I think, in the future, the pressure will come from the financial elite and from politics. And where the real decisions are made. That worries me more than organized crime. I don't want to define a word for that. I see the issue as stable at the moment.
So, I think it's really interesting for us listeners, and for me as well, that you're saying this with your background, because there's often a lot of panic mongering, and many people who talk about it, I think, often don't really know much about it. So it's actually reassuring to hear your well-founded perspective on this.
But then again, you have to differentiate. So, when we talk about organized crime, we're not referring to clan-related crime.
And
That is, of course, already an issue when cultures establish themselves here that then have their own rules and laws and no longer take the German state seriously. There are now lawless areas in many places across Germany. That's a different issue, but that's not what we, in intelligence services, refer to as organized crime. Rather, that's just a level below. And of course, there are tendencies there that are already starting to show, which give us more reason to be concerned.
I see. Thank you. Let's make the jump now. You then started out as a speaker. You started, from scratch, as they say. What were your first days of self-employment like? How did you get into it?
There was no scratch at all, and there wasn't even the idea of speaking. My father was a management consultant and was very successful in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Back then, employees were considered interchangeable resources. If someone didn't fit in with the company, they were shown the door, with a swift kick in the backside. If necessary, they'd even throw some money after them. That's changed a lot since then. But back when my father was so successful, management consulting was mainly about processes, product ranges, inventories, and structures. And it wasn't about soft skills, it wasn't about leadership, it wasn't about communication, it wasn't about culture. And my idea was to build a department within my father's company together with him. And then, once again, there was an interesting development. It turned out that when I held leadership training sessions, the classic leadership tools were interesting. But what my participants found even more interesting were the conversations during the breaks. Leo, where are you actually from? What did you do in the past? And from that, it developed into, why don't you give a talk about your work back then? Then the first publisher came along and said, why don't you write a book? The book, I'll Get You, The Art of Winning People Over, quickly became a Spiegel bestseller and stayed on the list for a long time. Then there was the first talk about the book, and that's when the Leo Martin brand slowly started to develop. Yeah, today, a lot of people are trying to be a human brand these days, and you think, human branding, that was a term that didn't even exist back then. Or at least, no one was talking about it. I didn't even notice it myself at the time. But during the process I was in, that's when this brand came to be. Without me following any kind of strategy, without even having the words for it. And it wasn't a process that happened overnight. We're talking about 3 to 4 years here. During that time, it developed organically, and the only role model I had back then was Eckhard von Hirschhausen.
Yeah.
He studied medicine at some point. No idea if, outside of his studies and some internships, he ever actually worked in a clinic for any length of time. I don't know, but he managed to do something, and that's just incredible. As a young hospital doctor, he would have worked himself to the bone. He would have had a 60 to 70-hour work week. He wouldn't have stood out from the gray mass of hospital doctors, but with the knowledge he had. He went into a completely different field, namely into the public eye. And he did one thing, he always kept his topics up to date, kept learning, staying informed, continuing his education. But he translated these medical topics in a way that both of us could understand them, and everyone else around us too, as well. And by doing that, he made himself into a brand and created value. And if I ever had a role model for a business model, then back then it was Eckhard von Hirschhausen. And in some ways, I have already followed his path. Tried to follow in his footsteps.
Yeah, it was an inspiration and, of course, I think it's also a really important role in all sorts of different areas. It's kind of like being a bridge builder or translator in society, taking a specific topic, which is really important, on one side, like medicine or health, and on the other side, the work of the state to defend itself against something that wants to abolish it. And to get that across, so that society, yes, to develop a better understanding there and to translate it in a way that makes it understandable. I think that's really commendable, but as you said, you sort of work your way into it, and it doesn't happen by just thinking your way into this new way of working that you had, but rather the other way around. Maybe you worked your way into a new way of thinking by doing it that way for years, organically, intuitively. And then at some point you realize, oh wow, I'm not human brand, and that's not wrong at all. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes I wonder about that, you know. Isn't there also a lot of competition with others working in this field too? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I did have a bit of a strategy, so in the end there was some of that involved after all. That means, if you look at America, the UK, or France, there are loads of former intelligence officers who eventually leave the service. And they move into the business world, take on leadership roles in corporations, or go into security. That just didn't happen in Germany. For 5 or 6 years, for about 10 years actually. I was the only intelligence officer who had left the service, who talked about his life, his experiences, and in doing so, created value. For others, so this whole topic of ex-agents was a unique selling point, and for a very long time, it really was a true USP. Then, here and there, a few profilers and a few criminal investigators came along afterwards, but no one else really managed to reach the same level that I had by then. Then I chose another strategic topic. I looked at what topic is truly essential and not already constantly covered by everyone else. And then I focused on the topic of building trust, of allowing people space, because that's exactly what I had to do as an operative in the intelligence service. A confidential informant in the world of organized crime, someone who really has no interest at all in making contact. To move them from resistance to cooperation with us in a short time and under high pressure. And you quickly notice which methods work and which don't. And by the way, that only works if you really understand what trust means. And if you go out now, or if anyone listening to us takes a moment to think about it, just really quickly, what does trust actually mean to me? Then you'll quickly realize that it's a huge concept. It has no beginning, no end, it's vague, it just slips right through your fingers. Ask 100 people and you'll get 100 different answers. And in the world of organized crime, if you don't know 100% what trust means, what it depends on, or whether someone is willing to do more for you than for others, to stand by your side, or to forgive your stupid mistake, the one you might have made by accident. If you can't define that 100%, then you also don't know what you need to do to reach the goal. So, on this topic, I bring more to the table than anyone else, and not many people really focus on the subject of trust. And the third unique selling point is that, right from the start, I focused on entertainment and amusement. My presentations have a show-like character throughout, with a high density of laughs. MHM. I'm not afraid to fail on stage. I take on challenges where, at the start, I don't know if I'll make it out in one piece. In the end, whether I'm seen as an expert or just as, well, that was nothing special. And that's what makes it exciting for me. That's what keeps it alive. That means I give it my all every single time. I can't just rest on some story I've learned or on content. I have to prove myself. Can I manage to get the other person under control or not? And that's quite a package. I haven't really experienced that much elsewhere, and maybe that's also the reason why I worked extremely well for such a long time until, of course, COVID threw everything off. I only did live entertainment. We only did big events and conferences. Sometimes up to 150 a year, without doing any marketing for it, without ever having sent a single email to any potential client. And that's something I think you just can't plan for.
No, that's also really, really successful when you can say, okay, it all basically came in as inbound. People came to you, or it was word of mouth, basically just through referrals. I'm really glad that you get the thrill, that it's not just off the rack, but that you really engage with something new every time. That's something I think people can really sense. Otherwise, if you just have your repertoire and play it over and over, I don't think that's really sustainable. Maybe that's your fourth USP, that you say, beyond the entertainment itself, it's about you. Challenging yourself and always finding new paths to take. One last point that interests me, because sometimes it really is a bit right on the knife's edge. Like, I was at the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, learned some things there. What am I actually allowed to say? What am I not allowed to say? Is it difficult to walk that fine line? Do you maybe have to? Check in again with your former employer. After all, there are, I think, very clear confidentiality obligations.
It's actually very simple. The first time I faced this question was when I wrote my first book. And then the publisher said, Leo, we have 3 options now. Option 1 is we coordinate with a former client or employer. But then we're dealing with an authority, which can be a real pain in the neck. Or the other option, option 2 is we just go for it and the book is out. And that was definitely more my style. And the condition for that, as the publisher put it very clearly, was that if you can judge what you're allowed to do and what you're not, so you don't end up tripping over your own feet in the end. So we'd rather just go for it, and the book is out. That method. And it's pretty clear what I'm allowed to do and what I'm not. The intelligence service, there aren't any secret communication, leadership, or psychological methods there. We draw from the same pool as every manager, every salesperson, every mom, every dad. That means there aren't any secret strategies, but there are tried and tested, practical strategies that are weatherproof. They've been tested and are practical, strategies that are agent-proof. But those are things you can talk about. What I can't talk about are names, numbers, data, facts, and very specific cases. So, whenever it's possible to draw conclusions about specific individuals who are our targets, regardless of whether they're on the perpetrator's side or the affected side, that's not allowed. And that's the crystal clear red line.
Actually, when you break it down the way you just did, it really is simple, just like you said. It's nice that we've managed to get right to the point, because as an outsider, you can easily feel a bit lost. But that was really, 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 really clarifying. And for me, it's also a good segue into forensic text analysis, which we still wanted to talk about, because that's something that comes from your training or even your experiences back then. Would you like to explain to us how you turned that into a business model? And maybe what listeners can quickly take away from this? In just a few minutes. I'm sure you can make it really interesting for us. Maybe give us a little teaser about forensic text analysis.
Once a detective, always a detective. That means I have the heart of an investigator, and suddenly I spent 10 years as a keynote speaker on the road, traveling to conferences and conventions, and I did leadership training for large companies. But that investigator's heart wasn't really being fulfilled anymore. And then, through a handful of coincidences, I ended up getting into the topics of language profiling and forensic linguistics. In short, we analyze threatening letters and press releases, and we can create author profiles for anonymous texts. So, with a high degree of probability, what does the author behind the text look like? It's not just about language skills or level of education, but also about regional identification within the entire German-speaking area. It's about determining an age range.
Sometimes.
There are even clues as to whether the author is male or female. That can help the police and security authorities in their search. We have a second major strength. We can compare texts with other texts. That means if an anonymous letter with threats, blackmail, or with false claims or slander lands on someone's desk somewhere in a company, classic example, a manager is accused, money is said to have been embezzled, or something similar. If there are any suspects, we can often find clues in these anonymous letters about who wrote them, because the knowledge contained in them is embedded, packaged in a way that not just anyone could have. Just suppose there's an anonymous letter and 15 possible suspects who could have written it. Then, through comparative linguistic analysis, that is, we look at how the anonymous author uses language, their choice of words, grammar, language psychology, and so on. What does the anonymous text look like? And if the same patterns show up in one of the comparison texts, then we can make a statement about how likely it is that person X or Y wrote it. So, in this way, we can also catch perpetrators or at the very least provide very strong evidence.
I find it incredibly useful, and I think it will also make all anonymous letter writers of this kind a bit, how should I put it, more cautious. So it's good that something is being done about it. Hasn't the explosion of AI now massively expanded the possibilities, or to put it another way, since you've been doing this professionally since 2018, if I'm not mistaken? How did it work before? Is there special software for that? Maybe you could give us a bit of a technical introduction. How does such a comparison work? So, is it actually done in a way that's economically efficient and even feasible?
Well, software has always been used for this, but it was nothing like software powered by a large language model like AI. Very, very simple concordance analyses were done. These are programs that simply compare every word and every character, every letter and every symbol from each text with every other letter and symbol from the comparison texts. That results in endless lists. And then there's software that sets markers and tries to identify patterns. But you always need an evaluator, a linguist, or a communications scientist or a Germanist who then acts as an expert and assesses every single clue and trace. And what AI will do to us, we still don't know. At the moment, we're using it for analysis. In a basic way. It's exciting. We're experimenting with it, of course. If you ask ChatGPT to write you an anonymous letter, then you'll get a lecture from ChatGPT that threats and blackmail are illegal and that you shouldn't do it. And so far, we haven't had a single case come up at the moment where we suspect that a text, a questionable text, was generated by AI. It's simple. If you have a sense of mission, if there's something you want to call out because your ego's been hurt or because you want to go after someone. It's about very specific issues. Otherwise, your threat wouldn't have any value at all. You're in an emotionally charged state, which means you're writing in a personal way. And even if you try to disguise it, you can only hide what you're aware of, the structure. But underneath, what happens unconsciously will stay relatively constant and stable. And the German used by ChatGPT and large language models is usually much better than that of our perpetrators. Or to put forward the hypothesis that, so far, we haven't had a single anonymously threatening letter generated by AI.
But it gets interesting when you move into the customized direction and, so to speak, maybe feed a customized ChatGPT with the knowledge it can actually filter out if you give it something like that to analyze. So, I think we're in the area where, as you said, we just don't know yet. what AI can achieve there. But maybe to wrap things up, one more question when you dive into this topic. And you do, I imagine it like this. You just said, a person whose ego is hurt, who wants to get back at someone here somehow, but... And in itself, that's a really bad psychological pattern, but obviously it happens often. So my question to you is, how often does it actually happen? Does it really happen? Are there any statistical analyses on this? Can you somehow say that this is actually, unfortunately, totally common? You always have to be careful how you report on it, because there are always those psychological copycats. So, if you compare it to society's values, how is it with this unfortunately actually pathological special group that does these kinds of things? How do you assess that?
Well, this is one of the many areas of crime with an extremely high number of unreported cases. There are several reasons for that. When slander, threats, or blackmail land on your doorstep, most companies we work for example, have no interest in making that public at all. They don't want the police or the public prosecutor's office involved, they just want clarity about the situation, so they can make decisions at the management level. And that's why there are no reports and no statistics that would be meaningful. That's one reason. The next issue is extortion isn't always the same as extortion. Threats aren't always the same as threats. Defamation isn't always the same as defamation. And insults aren't always the same as insults. Where do you draw the line? Where do you start and where do you stop? If I look online today, anonymous reviews or insults in comments that come from some fake profiles or pseudonymous accounts,
You'd never be done with it.
for us, an analysis session like that, when I have experts sitting in front of the screen, costs €140. That's not unusual. That's what a technician costs. It's the same at BMW in the auto shop, or with a physiotherapist in a private practice. So, that's a pretty reasonable price for an expert. And you need, in no time at all, even for a straightforward case, you end up with that. 30, 40, 50 hours of analysis, and that's not even talking about anything complex. So, when a court expert report lands on the table, that's €5,000 gone just like that.
I see.
So that means there has to be some pressure. That the pressure has to be big enough for a company, an authority, or in rare cases a private individual to say, no, it's worth it to me now. There's so much at stake that we're going to take this opportunity to investigate.
Great, yeah. Thanks so much for shedding light on this from the practical side, so that we as listeners can get an idea of how you actually go about it. How do you approach it? How is it done? And what does it cost? So, awesome. Leo. I think that's a great way to wrap things up. Really putting forensic text analysis front and center again like that. I thought it was super interesting. I hope our listeners did too, and that they'll like and give us feedback. On LinkedIn or on the podcast platforms, wherever. Leo, a huge thank you to you for being here today. I really thought it was great. Thanks a million.
I'm looking forward to our next meeting in person. Uli, thank you. Bye.
I'm looking forward to that too. Leo, take care. See you very soon. Bye-bye.
See you.